Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in a frozen courtyard in St. Petersburg. It's December 22nd, 1849. The air bites at your skin. You're 28 years old, and you have approximately 10 minutes left to live. The soldiers tie a blindfold around your eyes. You hear the clicking of rifles being loaded. Your heart pounds so hard, you think it might burst through your chest. This is it. This is how your story ends. A firing squad. All because you read forbidden books and talked about ideas that made the authorities nervous. And then, at the very last second, just as the soldiers raise their weapons, a messenger arrives on horseback. The Tsar has shown mercy. Your sentence has been commuted. You will not die today. Instead, you will spend the next 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, followed by years of military service. This was not a story. This was the actual experience of Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of the most profound minds humanity has ever produced. And that moment, standing before the firing squad, changed everything about how he understood human existence. Most of us have never faced death so directly. We push thoughts of mortality to the edges of our consciousness, hide them behind busy schedules and comfortable distractions. But Dostoevsky couldn't hide anymore. In those final moments before the expected gunshots, time itself seemed to change. He later described how every second became an eternity, how he saw his entire life with a clarity that normal consciousness never permits, how the world became unbearably beautiful and precious precisely because he was about to lose it forever. What happens to a mind that survives such an experience? What kind of philosophy emerges from someone who has genuinely tasted death and then been granted life again? The answer is a vision of human existence, so radical, so unflinching, and so deeply truthful that it continues to shake the foundations of how we understand ourselves more than a century after his death. Dostoevsky didn't write pleasant stories. He didn't offer comforting philosophies. He descended into the darkest territories of the human soul and brought back reports that still disturb us today. But here's what makes Dostoevsky unique among philosophers. He didn't discover his insides sitting in a comfortable study, theorizing about human nature from a safe distance. He lived through experiences that would have destroyed most people. The firing squad was just the beginning. He would spend years in brutal prison camps, witnessing cruelty that defied comprehension. He would suffer from epileptic seizures that brought him to the edge of consciousness. He would lose beloved children. He would battle a gambling addiction so severe it nearly destroyed his family. He would write some of his greatest works while racing against impossible deadlines, dictating to a stenographer while sick with fever, drowning in debt, and haunted by visions that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. All of this suffering, all of this darkness, became the raw material for a philosophical vision that predicted the great catastrophes of the 20th century with terrifying accuracy. Decades before the rise of totalitarian regimes, Dostoevsky understood exactly how they would operate and why millions would embrace them. Long before Freud explored the unconscious mind, Dostoevsky had mapped its most treacherous territories. Years before existentialists declared the death of God, Dostoevsky had wrestled with what that death would mean for human meaning and morality. You're going to journey through the mind of this extraordinary thinker. But this isn't going to be a comfortable journey. Dostoevsky doesn't let us rest easy with our assumptions about human goodness, rational progress, or the inevitability of moral improvement. He forces us to confront aspects of human nature that we prefer to ignore. Yet there's something deeply comforting about his unflinching honesty. In a world full of shallow optimism and convenient lies, Dostoevsky tells the truth about what it means to be human. And somehow, by facing the darkness without flinching, he points toward a light that is more real and more profound than any easy happiness could ever be. So settle in. Let your mind drift with these ideas. Some of what you will hear might disturb you, but all of it comes from a man who knew suffering intimately, who thought more deeply than almost anyone about why we suffer and what suffering means, and who ultimately believed that human beings are capable of transformation that approaches the divine. The story begins in the cold streets of 19th century Russia, but it speaks to every human heart in every age. Because Dostoevsky understood something that remains forever true, we are all standing before our own firing squads in one way or another, forced to choose how we will face the fundamental questions of existence. There's a paradox at the heart of human existence that most of us try very hard to avoid thinking about. We say we want freedom, that we value it above almost everything else. We fight wars for it. We build entire political systems around it. We consider it the foundation of human dignity. But Dostoevsky saw something that makes us uncomfortable. When faced with real freedom, most human beings will do almost anything to escape it. This isn't the freedom we usually talk about, the freedom to choose which career to pursue or which candidate to vote for. Dostoevsky is pointing to something much more fundamental and much more terrifying. He's talking about the freedom to choose between good and evil. The freedom to act against your own self-interest for no rational reason whatsoever. The freedom to destroy yourself and others simply because you can. The freedom to say no to God, to happiness, to love, to life itself. And here's the disturbing truth. We cannot give up this freedom even if we desperately want to. Think about it for a moment. Even when you try to surrender your freedom to someone else, to some authority or system or ideology, you're still making a free choice to surrender. Even when you claim that your actions are determined by your genes or your upbringing or your circumstances, you're freely choosing to accept that explanation. Freedom haunts every human moment. It lurks behind every decision. We are, as later thinkers would say, condemned to be free. Dostoevsky discovered this truth, not through abstract reasoning, but through watching real human beings in extreme circumstances. In that Siberian prison camp, he witnessed something that shattered the comfortable assumptions of his educated, liberal youth. He had expected to find that criminals were driven to their crimes by poverty, ignorance, or corrupted social conditions. Fix the social conditions, provide education, and crime would disappear. This was what all the progressive thinkers believed. But what he actually found was far more disturbing. He met men who had committed terrible crimes, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others had committed murder or robbery as a form of rebellion, a way of asserting their will against all social constraints. Still others appeared to have crossed moral boundaries, simply to see what it felt like, to test the ultimate limits of human behavior. These men weren't monsters from another species. They were recognizably human. They could be intelligent, even charming. Some showed genuine kindness in certain circumstances, but they had made fundamental choices about how to live that had led them down dark paths. And those choices couldn't be explained away by material conditions or lack of education. This realization forced Dostoevsky to a disturbing conclusion. The capacity for evil exists in every human heart. We're not blank slates molded entirely by our environment. We're not rational calculators who always choose what serves our best interests. We're complex beings with genuine freedom to choose between different paths, including paths that lead to destruction. But why would anyone choose evil? Why would a free being deliberately choose to cause suffering, to destroy beauty, to reject love? Dostoevsky's answer is both simple and profound, because choosing evil is often the only way to prove that you're free. He illustrates this through one of the most important characters in all of literature, the underground man. This former government clerk has withdrawn from society and spends his time writing bitter notes about human nature. He's brilliant, self-aware, and completely miserable. He understands exactly what he should do to improve his life. But he refuses to do it. He sabotages his own happiness. He destroys his relationships. He wallows in suffering. Why? Because it's the only way he can assert his freedom. By choosing to be miserable, he proves that he's not a machine programmed for happiness. He would rather suffer as a free being than be happy as a slave to natural or social laws. The underground man says something shocking. What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead. Even if that choice leads to destruction and suffering, it's still worth it, because it proves autonomy. This is the dark heart of human freedom. We will sometimes choose suffering over happiness, if suffering is the only way to prove we're not predictable. We will act against our own interests, simply to demonstrate that we cannot be reduced to logical formulas. We are willing to go to hell as long as we can choose hell for ourselves, rather than having heaven imposed upon us. Now, you might be thinking, this is just perversity, just irrationality. Surely this isn't how normal people actually behave. But look closely at your own life. Haven't you ever done something you knew was bad for you, not because you wanted the consequences, but because you wanted to prove that nobody could tell you what to do? Haven't you ever rejected good advice precisely because it was advice, because accepting it would mean admitting you needed help? Haven't you ever been drawn to the forbidden, specifically because it was forbidden? This perverse aspect of freedom shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. The teenager who ruins her own future to rebel against her parents' expectations. The alcoholic who keeps drinking even though he knows it's destroying his life. The person who sabotages a good relationship because getting close to someone feels like losing control. The brilliant student who deliberately fails because succeeding would mean playing by rules he didn't choose. Dostoevsky understood that this wasn't pathological behavior that could be cured with better education or therapy. This was something fundamental to human nature itself. Any system that tries to perfect human beings by eliminating their capacity to choose wrongly will ultimately fail. Any ideology that promises to create happiness by removing the possibility of choosing unhappiness will produce rebellion and resentment. But Dostoevsky didn't stop with this dark insight. He also showed us what freedom looks like when it's exercised in service of love rather than rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Myshkin demonstrate that it's possible to freely choose goodness, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These characters aren't naive or weak. They understand the full horror of human existence. They've seen evil. They know about suffering. They understand the temptation to despair. But they freely choose to respond with love anyway. And this choice is even more radical than choosing evil, because it's harder. It's easy to be destructive. It's easy to say no. But to say yes to love, to goodness, to other people, when you could just as easily say no, that requires tremendous courage and strength. This positive freedom isn't something that can be programmed or taught or legislated into existence. It must be chosen freely by each person in the depths of their soul. And it must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, throughout an entire lifetime. This is why Dostoevsky believed that freedom was ultimately a spiritual rather than political category. True freedom doesn't come from the absence of external constraints. It comes from the presence of internal grace. It's the freedom to love, even when love isn't returned. To forgive, even when forgiveness isn't deserved. To hope, even when hope seems impossible. And here's the hard truth that Dostoevsky forces us to face. The path to this higher freedom leads through suffering. We live in a culture that views suffering as something to be eliminated through technology or medication or social reform. But Dostoevsky argues that suffering is often the only way human beings learn to exercise their freedom responsibly. Suffering breaks down our illusions of self-sufficiency. It forces us to confront the deepest questions of existence. It strips away our pretenses and reveals who we really are beneath all our social masks. It teaches us compassion for others who suffer. It opens our hearts to the possibility of redemption. Without suffering, we would remain spiritually immature, incapable of genuine love or authentic choice. The person who has never suffered deeply will likely remain trapped in shallow certainties and comfortable illusions. But the person who has been broken by suffering and then healed by grace will understand that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any rational system can capture. Consider this: your freedom is both your greatest burden and your greatest gift. You cannot escape it. You cannot hand it off to someone else. Every moment, you're choosing who you want to become, and those choices matter infinitely, even when it seems like nothing matters at all. The question isn't whether you'll be free. You already are, whether you like it or not. The question is, what will you do with this terrible, beautiful gift? Imagine living entirely inside your own head, watching yourself think, watching yourself feel, watching yourself watch yourself. Every emotion filtered through layers of analysis, every impulse questioned, every action calculated and recalculated until the original spark of spontaneity dies completely. This is the condition of the underground man, and Dostoevsky understood that it was becoming the condition of modern consciousness itself. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would become the archetype of modern alienation. The underground man isn't just a neurotic individual. He's a prophet of what human consciousness would become in the modern world: hyper-aware, paralyzed by self-consciousness, unable to act naturally, disconnected from genuine feeling. He begins his confession with these famous words: "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man." But these aren't just insults. They're precise diagnoses. He's sick with excessive self-awareness. He's spiteful because his intelligence has revealed the futility of existence. He's unattractive because his mind has made him incapable of natural human connection. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, religious faith. But he's been exposed to modern education, scientific thinking, philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He cannot act on impulse without analyzing his motives. He cannot make any decision without seeing all possible objections to that decision. Think about how this feels. You want to do something simple. Go to a party, start a project, tell someone you care about them. But immediately, your mind begins its analysis. What are your real motives? What will other people think? What might go wrong? Is this really what you want, or just what you think you should want? By the time you finish analyzing, the original desire has evaporated. This is analysis paralysis, and Dostoevsky understood it decades before psychologists gave it a name. But the problem goes deeper than overthinking. The underground man has also lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences is filtered through multiple layers of self-consciousness, until the original feeling is completely distorted. When he feels angry, he immediately begins analyzing the anger. Is it justified? How will others judge it? What does it say about him psychologically? By the time he finishes this analysis, the anger has transformed into something else entirely, usually self-hatred or bitter resentment. He cannot experience any emotion purely because his mind immediately begins dissecting every feeling. He becomes a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. This creates a fundamental alienation from his own inner life, and it makes authentic expression impossible. Everything he says or does feels artificial because it's been filtered through so many layers of self-consciousness. Now add social anxiety to this mix. The underground man desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes normal interaction almost impossible. When he enters a room full of people, he immediately begins analyzing how they're perceiving him. Every facial expression, every tone of voice becomes evidence of rejection or contempt. He becomes so focused on managing his image that he loses all ability to be genuinely present. His attempts at conversation feel forced and awkward because he's constantly monitoring himself rather than simply responding naturally. This creates a vicious cycle. Because he feels awkward, he begins avoiding social situations. But the more he isolates himself, the more awkward he becomes. Eventually, he develops theories about why other people are inferior and why solitude is preferable. These theories are really just defense mechanisms protecting his wounded ego. But he convinces himself. They represent sophisticated philosophical insights. He transforms his psychological problems into intellectual positions. Dostoevsky saw this pattern everywhere in modern intellectual culture. People who couldn't connect with others because of their own psychological issues would develop elaborate theories about why human connection was impossible or undesirable. Their personal failures became philosophical principles. The underground man also exhibits cognitive dissonance, holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously and being driven to irrational behavior by the tension between them. He claims to value reason above everything but acts completely irrationally. He insists he wants to be left alone, but becomes furious when people ignore him. He declares that he despises society but desperately craves social approval. These contradictions aren't temporary or accidental. They're built into the structure of modern consciousness itself. Modern ideology has taught him to believe in reason, individual autonomy, scientific materialism. But human beings aren't purely rational creatures. These modern beliefs cannot satisfy deeper emotional and spiritual needs. The result is permanent internal conflict between what he thinks he should believe and what he actually experiences. His mind has been modernized, but his heart still yearns for meaning, connection, transcendence. This creates a peculiar form of suffering that's distinctly modern. In earlier ages, people suffered from poverty, disease, war. These forms of suffering were terrible, but comprehensible. The underground man suffers from something more subtle and isolating. He suffers from the inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, to connect authentically with anyone. He suffers from the loss of meaning, purpose, genuine emotion. This is the suffering of modern alienation, and it's more devastating than physical hardship because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. And here's what makes it worse. The underground man knows exactly what his problems are. He's brilliantly self-aware. He can analyze his own psychological patterns with devastating accuracy. But this knowledge doesn't help. In fact, it makes things worse. He becomes trapped in endless layers of self-consciousness, analyzing his analysis, critiquing his critique, until he can no longer distinguish between genuine insight and psychological manipulation. Simply understanding your problems doesn't solve them. And excessive self-analysis can become a new form of pathology. The underground man's response to his suffering is both pathetic and prophetic. Unable to find genuine meaning or connection, he begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art. He develops elaborate theories about why suffering is superior to happiness. He convinces himself that his alienation is actually a sign of superior sensitivity and intelligence. He transforms his psychological problems into badges of honor. This is exactly what happened to many intellectual movements in the 20th century. When people couldn't find positive meaning, they began finding meaning in their victimhood, their alienation, their rejection of conventional values. But Dostoevsky doesn't simply diagnose the problem. He also suggests a solution, though it's not an easy one. The underground man's problems stem from excessive reliance on rational analysis and disconnection from deeper sources of meaning. He's lost touch with his capacity for faith, love, self-transcendence. These capacities cannot be recovered through more thinking or better psychological techniques. They require a fundamental reorientation of the soul towards something greater than the individual ego. The underground man must learn to stop analyzing himself long enough to actually live, to stop protecting himself long enough to love, to stop asserting his autonomy long enough to surrender to something transcendent. This is why Dostoevsky believed that the crisis of modern consciousness was ultimately spiritual rather than psychological. No amount of therapy or education could solve these problems. What's needed is complete transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. The underground man needs to rediscover wonder, reverence, genuine human connection. But this transformation cannot be achieved through willpower or intellectual effort. It requires grace. And grace comes only to those who acknowledge their own helplessness and open themselves to redemption. As you settle into sleep, consider whether you recognize any of these patterns in your own consciousness. Do you sometimes feel like you're watching yourself live rather than actually living? Do you analyze your emotions until they become unrecognizable? Do you find it hard to act spontaneously without second-guessing every impulse? If so, you're not alone. You're experiencing the condition that Dostoevsky identified more than a century ago, the condition of modern consciousness itself. And while there's no easy escape from this condition, understanding it is the first step towards something better. The 19th century was drunk on the promise of reason. Science was solving ancient mysteries. Technology was transforming daily life. Education was spreading. Progress seemed inevitable. Intellectuals across Europe believed that human reason could solve every problem, eliminate suffering, create perfect societies. To most educated people, these beliefs seemed obviously correct. But Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions that would lead to catastrophe. His critique of rationalism begins with a simple but devastating observation. Human beings are not primarily rational creatures. The rationalists assume that people made decisions based on careful calculation of self-interest. Show someone what's truly in their best interest, and they'll naturally pursue it. If people behave irrationally or self-destructively, it must be because they lack proper education or live in corrupted social conditions. Fix the education, reform the social conditions, and human behavior will automatically improve. This sounds reasonable, even humane. But Dostoevsky recognized it as a catastrophic misreading of human psychology. People are emotional, spiritual, often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against their own self-interest for reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes we choose to suffer because suffering feels more authentic than artificial happiness. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would mean admitting we need help. Sometimes we embrace destructive behaviors because they give us a sense of power we can't find in healthy activities. Consider Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He commits murder not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove he's extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. His crime makes no logical sense. It actually destroys his chances of success. But logic isn't what's driving him. He's driven by deep psychological needs that operate below the level of rational awareness. This insight has devastating implications for all utopian political schemes. If people don't behave rationally, then rational social planning cannot create perfect societies. If behavior is driven by unconscious psychological forces, then conscious education cannot eliminate antisocial behavior. If people sometimes choose suffering over happiness for existential reasons, then material improvement cannot guarantee human contentment. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools fundamentally inadequate to the task. But Dostoevsky's critique goes deeper. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse rather than better. When people try to live purely rational lives, they cut themselves off from their own emotional and spiritual depths. They become like the underground man, trapped in their heads, unable to feel genuine emotions or make authentic connections. They lose touch with sources of meaning, beauty, transcendence that make life worth living. Rationalism doesn't solve the human condition, it impoverishes it. Scientific materialism creates even more serious problems. When people view themselves as nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and chemical laws, they lose their sense of human dignity and moral responsibility. If all behavior can be explained by genetics, neurology, social conditioning, then concepts like free will, moral choice, personal accountability become meaningless. Why should anyone feel guilty if their actions were determined by forces beyond their control? Why should anyone strive for moral improvement if morality is just a social construction? Why should anyone sacrifice immediate desires for higher principles if there are no higher principles, only competing biological drives? Dostoevsky saw that scientific materialism would ultimately lead to nihilism, the belief that nothing has ultimate meaning or value. If humans are just accidental products of blind evolution, our lives have no inherent purpose. If consciousness is just brain chemistry, our deepest thoughts and feelings are just chemical reactions. If moral values are just social constructions, they have no binding authority over individual behavior. The logical conclusion of scientific materialism is that existence is fundamentally absurd and all human striving is ultimately meaningless. This realization drives sensitive people to despair and less sensitive people to ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political implications are terrifying. If there are no objective moral truths, then might makes right. If human beings have no inherent dignity, they can be manipulated and destroyed without moral qualms. If traditional values are just arbitrary social constructions, they can be swept away and replaced with whatever ideology serves those in power. If reason is the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals have the right to impose their rational schemes on everyone else, regardless of what ordinary people want or believe. Dostoevsky recognized that this combination of nihilism and rationalism would eventually produce totalitarian movements that would treat human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. His novels are filled with characters who embody this dangerous combination. Raskolnikov believes exceptional individuals have the right to transgress moral law for rational purposes. The revolutionaries and demons are willing to commit murder and terrorism in service of their ideologies. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the masses cannot handle freedom and must be controlled by an enlightened elite. In each case, rational arguments justify irrational and immoral behavior. The characters convince themselves they're serving higher purposes, but they're really serving their own psychological needs for power and significance. Dostoevsky also understood that rationalism and materialism would fail to satisfy the deepest human needs. People need meaning, purpose, beauty, love, transcendence. They need to feel their lives matter in some ultimate sense. They need to believe their moral choices have real significance. They need to experience wonder and reverence. Rationalism and materialism cannot provide these things because they explicitly deny their reality or importance. A worldview that reduces everything to matter and motion cannot account for consciousness, beauty, love, moral obligation. It leaves people spiritually starved in the midst of material abundance. This spiritual starvation creates terrible emptiness that people try to fill with substitutes. Some become addicted to pleasure and novel experiences. Others lose themselves in work and achievement. Still others embrace political ideologies that promise meaning through identification with grand historical movements. But none of these substitutes truly satisfy the human need for transcendent meaning. They provide temporary distraction, but cannot heal the spiritual wound. Dostoevsky's alternative to rationalism isn't irrationalism or anti-intellectualism. He was himself highly intellectual and engaged seriously with philosophical and scientific ideas. His critique of reason was based on reason itself, but he insisted that reason must be balanced by faith, emotion, spiritual intuition. Human beings need all their faculties working together in harmony. Reason without faith becomes cold and destructive. Faith without reason becomes fanatical and superstitious. But reason guided by faith and grounded in spiritual reality can serve human flourishing. This is why he placed such emphasis on suffering in human development. Suffering breaks down intellectual pride and forces us to confront realities that cannot be understood through reason alone. It opens us to the possibility of grace, redemption, spiritual transformation. A person who has never suffered deeply will likely remain trapped in the illusion that life can be mastered through intelligence and willpower. But a person who has been broken by suffering and then healed by grace will understand that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any rational system can capture. As sleep begins to take you, let this thought settle in your mind. Reason is a gift, a tool, a necessary part of being human. But it's not sufficient for understanding what it means to be human. The deepest truths about existence cannot be captured in equations or syllogisms. They can only be lived, felt, experienced in the depths of your soul. Most people in Dostoevsky's time believed that evil came from ignorance, poverty, or corrupted social institutions. Fix the external conditions, they argued, and evil would disappear. But Dostoevsky had seen too much to accept such comfortable theories. He knew that evil came from somewhere much darker and more mysterious, the human heart itself. This was his most disturbing and revolutionary insight. Evil doesn't primarily come from external circumstances. It comes from free choices made in the depths of the human soul. His understanding was shaped by those 4 years in the Siberian prison camp where he lived among murderers, thieves, violent criminals. He had expected to find that these men had been driven to crime by desperate circumstances or lack of education. Instead, he discovered that many had committed their crimes not out of necessity, but out of choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others had committed murder or robbery as a form of self-assertion, a rebellion against all authority. Still others appeared to have crossed moral boundaries simply to see what it felt like, to experience the ultimate transgression. What disturbed Dostoevsky most was that these men were recognizably human. They weren't monsters. They shared the same basic psychological makeup as everyone else. They had the capacity for reason, emotion, moral understanding. Many were intelligent, some were charming. A few were even capable of genuine kindness in certain circumstances. But they had made fundamental choices that led them down dark paths. If people like this could become criminals, then the potential for evil existed in everyone. This forced Dostoevsky to confront an uncomfortable truth. We are not blank slates molded entirely by environment. We are not rational calculators who always choose self-interest. We are complex beings with contradictory impulses, including genuine impulses toward evil. Every human being contains the capacity for both sainthood and criminality. Which path we take depends not primarily on our circumstances, but on moral choices we make in the depths of our souls. He explores this most powerfully through Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is intelligent, sensitive, from a respectable family. He's received good education. He holds progressive social views. He's not driven to crime by poverty or desperation, though these factors play a role. Instead, he chooses murder because he wants to prove he's an extraordinary individual who can transcend conventional morality. He has convinced himself through rational arguments that killing a worthless old woman and redistributing her money would be morally justified. But Dostoevsky shows us that these rational justifications are elaborate self-deceptions. The real motivation is psychological rather than philosophical. He wants to experience the ultimate assertion of will and power. He wants to prove he's not bound by moral rules that constrain ordinary people. He wants to feel what it's like to hold the power of life and death. The murder isn't really about helping the poor. It's about feeding his ego and satisfying deep psychological needs. What makes Raskolnikov so disturbing is that his psychological profile isn't fundamentally different from many intellectuals and activists. How many people have committed terrible acts claiming to serve humanity? How many revolutionaries have justified murder and terrorism by claiming to serve the greater good? Raskolnikov represents the dangerous combination of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that characterizes so many modern movements. Dostoevsky also understood that evil often emerges not from dramatic moral failures, but from small compromises and gradual spiritual deterioration. Most people don't wake up and decide to become criminals. Instead, they make a series of seemingly minor moral compromises that slowly erode their capacity for ethical judgment. They tell small lies that prepare them for bigger lies. They rationalize minor selfishness that prepares them for major selfishness. They ignore small injustices that prepare them to participate in larger injustices. Over time, these compromises create a pattern of moral numbness that makes serious evil possible. This process is illustrated brilliantly through Smerdyakov in The Brothers Karamazov. Smerdyakov isn't born evil. He grows up in an environment of moral corruption and cynicism. He observes the hypocrisy and selfishness of adults around him. He gradually learns to manipulate others for his own advantage. He develops a philosophy of nihilistic opportunism that justifies any action serving his interests. By the time he commits murder, he has already lost any genuine capacity for moral feeling. The crime is simply the logical culmination of lifelong spiritual deterioration. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight concerns evil's relationship to freedom. Evil is not an unfortunate accident that can be eliminated through proper social engineering. Evil is an inevitable consequence of human freedom itself. If people are truly free to choose between good and evil, some will choose evil. If people have the capacity for genuine love, they also have the capacity for genuine hatred. If people can sacrifice themselves for others, they can also sacrifice others for themselves. Freedom necessarily includes the freedom to choose wrongly, and this means evil can never be completely eliminated from human existence. This doesn't mean we should be passive in the face of evil, or that we shouldn't work to reduce suffering and injustice. But it does mean we shouldn't expect to create perfect societies or eliminate the possibility of moral failure. Any political system that promises to end evil through social reform is either naive or dishonest. Any psychological theory that reduces evil to mental illness or social dysfunction misses something essential about human nature. Any system that tries to explain away the reality of genuine moral choice denies fundamental truth about what it means to be human. Dostoevsky also recognized that attempts to eliminate evil often create worse evils. When people become convinced they can perfect human nature through rational planning, they often become willing to use extreme measures against those who resist their plans. If crime is caused by social conditions rather than individual choice, then criminals aren't responsible for their actions. But those who perpetuate the social conditions that cause crime become the real villains who deserve whatever fate reformers choose to impose. This logic leads inevitably to persecution of anyone who stands in the way of social progress. The attempt to create a perfect society ends up producing societies far more evil than the traditional societies they replace. The characters in Demons illustrate this perfectly. They begin with genuine concerns about social injustice and sincere desire to help the oppressed. But commitment to revolutionary ideology gradually overwhelms basic human decency. They become willing to lie, steal, murder in service of their cause. They convince themselves that personal hatred and resentment are actually noble commitment to justice. They end up becoming far more destructive than the social problems they originally set out to solve. The only realistic response to the problem of evil, according to Dostoevsky, is spiritual rather than political or social. We cannot eliminate evil through better institutions or improved education. We can only combat evil through individual moral and spiritual transformation. Each person must confront the capacity for evil within their own heart and choose to struggle against it. This struggle never ends and never achieves final victory in this life, but is the only way to maintain our humanity in the face of the darkness that surrounds and pervades us, and occasionally, through grace and genuine repentance, it can lead to real redemption and transformation. Let this truth settle into your consciousness as you drift toward sleep. You contain the capacity for both good and evil. Every day, every moment, you're choosing which to cultivate, and those choices matter infinitely, even when no one else is watching. The battle between good and evil isn't out there in the world. It's in here, in the human heart, in your heart. And the outcome of that battle will determine not just your own fate, but the fate of everyone your life touches. There's a question that has tormented sensitive souls throughout human history. How can a loving and all-powerful God permit innocent suffering? Most religious thinkers try to answer with theological explanations about free will, the greater good, or mysterious divine purposes. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too deeply acquainted with suffering to accept easy answers. Instead, through the character of Ivan Karamazov, he presented the problem in its starkest and most emotionally devastating form. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual who understands all the traditional arguments for God's existence and all the standard explanations for why a good God permits evil. But he has also collected stories of innocent children being tortured and murdered by adults. These aren't abstract philosophical examples. They're detailed accounts of real human suffering that Ivan has gathered from newspapers and historical records. When he confronts the reality of this suffering, all theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother Alyosha about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions. They would beat her, lock her in an outhouse overnight in freezing cold, force her to eat her own excrement. The child would pray to God for protection, but no protection came. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan asks Alyosha a simple but devastating question. Can you understand why a little creature, who can't even understand what's being done to her, should beat her little heart with her tiny fist in the dark and cold, weeping tears to God for protection? And what can we say about a God who hears such prayers and does nothing? Ivan presents many such stories, each more heartbreaking than the last. A general orders his hunting dogs to tear apart a peasant boy, because the child accidentally injured one of the general's favorite hounds. Turkish soldiers in Bulgaria entertain themselves by throwing babies into the air and catching them on their bayonets. Parents across the world beat, starve, sexually abuse their own children, while the children cry out for help that never comes. These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns of cruelty that have repeated themselves throughout human history. Every generation produces new examples of innocent suffering that seem to make a mockery of any belief in divine justice or cosmic meaning. The standard religious response is that God works in mysterious ways that human beings cannot understand. Perhaps the suffering serves some greater purpose that will be revealed in the afterlife. Perhaps it's necessary for the development of human character. Perhaps the suffering will be compensated by eternal happiness in heaven. But Ivan rejects all such explanations as morally obscene. No greater good could possibly justify the torture of innocent children. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires even one child to suffer unjustly, then Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. He presents his rejection in terms both logically rigorous and emotionally overwhelming. He tells Alyosha that he doesn't reject God himself, but he cannot accept the world that God has created. He refuses to participate in any cosmic plan built on the foundation of innocent suffering. Even if he could be shown that all suffering will eventually be justified and all injustice made right, he would still reject the ticket to such a universe. Some things are simply too precious to be sacrificed for any purpose, no matter how noble. The tears of a tortured child cannot be wiped away by any amount of future happiness or cosmic justice. This position isn't atheism in the ordinary sense. Ivan isn't arguing that God doesn't exist or that religious claims are factually incorrect. He's making a moral argument against the universe itself. Even if God exists, and even if there's a divine plan that will ultimately make everything right, Ivan refuses to endorse such a plan. He would rather be damned than participate in a cosmic system that treats innocent suffering as an acceptable means to any end. This is rebellion not against God's existence, but against God's justice. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition and begins performing miracles and healing the sick. The Grand Inquisitor, representing the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has Jesus arrested. He visits Jesus in his prison cell and explains why the Church must reject and execute him. The problem is that Jesus offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden most people cannot bear. The Church has corrected Jesus' mistake by offering people security, certainty, relief from the terrible responsibility of having to choose for themselves. The Grand Inquisitor argues that Jesus was wrong to reject the 3 temptations offered by Satan in the wilderness. Satan offered to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve human material needs. Jesus rejected this, insisting that people don't live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people aren't spiritual enough to care about anything beyond physical survival. By refusing to solve the problem of hunger and poverty, Jesus condemned the majority of humanity to perpetual suffering. A truly loving God would have chosen to feed people rather than preserving their spiritual freedom. Satan also offered Jesus the chance to prove his divinity by throwing himself from the temple and having angels save him. This represents the power of miracle, the ability to compel belief through supernatural demonstrations. Jesus rejected this too, insisting that faith must be freely chosen rather than forced through overwhelming evidence. But the Inquisitor argues that most people desperately want certainty and are tormented by doubt. By refusing to provide irrefutable proof of his divinity, Jesus left humanity to struggle with agonizing questions about God's existence and nature. A truly compassionate God would have provided clear evidence that would eliminate all doubt. Finally, Satan offered Jesus dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth, representing the power to create perfect social and political institutions. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear social order to live decent lives. By refusing to establish a perfect earthly kingdom, Jesus left humanity to struggle with war, injustice, political chaos. A truly wise God would have taken political power and used it to create conditions under which all people could live in peace and prosperity. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that the Church has corrected Jesus' mistakes by providing exactly what Satan offered and Jesus rejected. The Church feeds people through charitable works, provides certainty through doctrines and authority, creates social order through political influence. In doing so, it has made the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under Jesus' original plan. Only a small number of spiritually exceptional individuals can handle the freedom Jesus offered. For everyone else, freedom is a curse rather than a blessing. The Church has taken this burden upon itself and given people the security and happiness they actually want. This parable presents the problem of innocent suffering in its most sophisticated form. If God really loves humanity, why does he permit people to suffer when he has the power to prevent that suffering? The only possible answer seems to be that God values human freedom more than human happiness. But this means God is willing to sacrifice the welfare of actual people for the sake of an abstract principle. Is this really love? Or is it a form of cosmic cruelty dressed up in religious language? Ivan's rebellion forces us to confront the possibility that the universe itself is morally unacceptable. Dostoevsky doesn't provide easy answers to these devastating questions. He presents Ivan's arguments with complete intellectual honesty and emotional power. But he also shows us the human cost of Ivan's rebellion. Ivan's rejection of God's world leads him to a philosophy of nihilistic despair. If there's no cosmic justice, then there are no objective moral truths. If innocent suffering is meaningless, then all human striving is meaningless. If God doesn't care about human welfare, then perhaps nothing matters at all. Ivan's intellectual integrity leads him to conclusions that make life unbearable. The alternative is represented by his brother Alyosha, who accepts the mystery of innocent suffering without being able to explain it. Alyosha doesn't have better theological arguments than Ivan. He cannot provide satisfying explanations for why children suffer. But he chooses to trust in God's goodness, despite evidence that seems to contradict it. He responds to suffering, not with intellectual analysis, but with practical love and compassion. He cannot solve the problem of evil, but he can work to reduce actual suffering in the lives of real people. His faith isn't based on rational arguments, but on direct experience of grace and redemption. Dostoevsky suggests that the problem of innocent suffering cannot be solved through philosophical reasoning. It can only be lived through and responded to with love. This doesn't make the suffering any less real or tragic, but it offers a way of maintaining both intellectual honesty and spiritual hope in the face of life's deepest mysteries. As you drift towards sleep, hold this paradox in your mind. The world contains suffering so terrible that it seems to disprove the existence of a loving God. Yet the world also contains love so profound that it seems to prove it. Both are true. Both are real. And somehow you must find a way to live with both truths at once. The parable of the Grand Inquisitor is perhaps the most powerful political prophecy ever written. In just a few pages, Dostoevsky predicted the rise of totalitarian movements, explained the psychological appeal of authoritarianism, and exposed the fundamental tension between human freedom and human happiness. The setting is 16th century Spain, but the implications extend far beyond any particular time or place into the deepest questions of political philosophy and human nature. Picture this. Jesus Christ has returned to earth and is walking through the streets of Seville, quietly performing miracles and comforting the suffering. The people recognize him immediately and begin to gather around in wonder and hope. But the Grand Inquisitor observes this scene with alarm. He orders his guards to arrest Jesus and throw him into prison. That night, the Inquisitor visits Jesus in his cell and delivers a long monologue, explaining why the Church must reject and execute him. The Inquisitor's argument is both chilling and logically compelling. He acknowledges that Jesus is indeed who he claims to be, and that his original teachings were authentic. But he argues that Jesus made a fundamental error in his understanding of human nature. Jesus offered humanity freedom. But freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. The vast majority of human beings are weak, ignorant, spiritually immature. They don't want the responsibility of making their own moral and spiritual choices. They want to be told what to believe, how to behave, what their lives mean. They want security, certainty, relief from the agonizing burden of having to think and choose for themselves. The Church has corrected Jesus' mistake by giving people exactly what they actually want, rather than what Jesus thought they should want. Instead of demanding that people exercise freedom to choose between good and evil, the Church has made the choice for them. Instead of requiring people to develop their own relationship with God through struggle and doubt, the Church has provided authoritative answers to all spiritual questions. Instead of leaving people to wrestle with moral ambiguity and uncertainty, the Church has given them clear rules that eliminate the need for difficult decisions. The result is a humanity that is much happier, more peaceful, more unified than it would have been under Jesus' original plan. Now think about what the Inquisitor is really saying. He's claiming that the Church has corrected Jesus' mistakes by embracing exactly what Satan offered and Jesus rejected. Satan offered bread, the promise to solve material need and economic inequality. The Church feeds people through charitable works. Satan offered miracle, the power to compel belief through overwhelming evidence. The Church provides certainty through doctrines and authority. Satan offered dominion, the power to create perfect political institutions. The Church creates social order through political influence. The Inquisitor concludes that Satan understood human nature better than Jesus did. Satan offered exactly what most people actually want and need. The Church has embraced all three of these gifts and used them to create a system that makes the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under Jesus' original plan. Only a small number of spiritually exceptional individuals can handle the freedom that Jesus offered. For everyone else, freedom is a curse rather than a blessing. The Church has taken this burden upon itself and given people the security and happiness they actually want. This argument is terrifying because it contains enough truth to be plausible. How many people really want the responsibility of making their own moral and spiritual choices? How many would rather have economic security than economic freedom? How many would rather have certainty and truth if the two conflict? How many would rather have strong leaders making decisions for them than participate in messy democratic governance? The Inquisitor's vision of humanity is cynical, but it's not obviously false. Dostoevsky wrote this parable decades before the rise of fascism and communism, but it perfectly describes the appeal of totalitarian movements. Both fascist and communist regimes offered their populations exactly what the Grand Inquisitor promised. They promised to solve economic problems through centralized planning and state control. They promised certainty through official ideology that would answer all questions and eliminate doubt. They promised strong leadership that would make all important decisions and relieve ordinary people of political responsibility. And millions of people embraced these systems precisely because they offered relief from the burden of freedom. The parable also explains why democratic societies are always fragile and why freedom is always in danger of being lost. Democracy requires citizens to educate themselves about complex issues, make difficult choices, accept responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. This is hard work that many people would rather avoid. It's much easier to let someone else make the decisions and then blame them when things go wrong. It's much more comfortable to have clear ideological answers than to wrestle with ambiguous questions that have no easy solutions. The appeal of authoritarianism isn't primarily economic or political, but psychological. It offers relief from the existential burden of being free. But Dostoevsky doesn't end the parable with the Inquisitor's monologue. After listening silently to the entire argument, Jesus responds not with words but with a simple action. He approaches the old Inquisitor and gently kisses him on his aged lips. This kiss contains no argument, no refutation, no explanation. It's simply an expression of love for a human being who has lost his way. The Inquisitor is deeply moved by this gesture, but he doesn't change his mind. He releases Jesus and tells him never to return. Jesus leaves in silence, and the Inquisitor continues with his work of managing humanity for its own good. This ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be resolved through rational argument. Both positions have compelling logic behind them. The choice ultimately comes down to a fundamental decision about what human beings are and what they're capable of becoming. Jesus represents faith in human potential and the belief that freedom is worth the cost it requires. The Inquisitor represents compassionate realism about human limitations and the belief that most people need protection from their own freedom. Each position contains both truth and error, and the tension between them can never be completely resolved. What Dostoevsky shows us is that this choice is always before us, both individually and collectively. We can choose the path of freedom with all its risks, uncertainties, painful responsibilities, or we can choose the path of security with all its comforts, certainties, protected dependencies. Neither choice is obviously right or wrong, and both exact a price from those who make them. But the choice itself cannot be avoided, and the consequences of our choice will shape not only our own lives, but the lives of future generations. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider this. Every time you choose convenience over challenge, every time you accept someone else's answer instead of struggling with questions yourself, every time you trade a bit of freedom for a bit of security, you're making the Grand Inquisitor's choice. And every time you insist on thinking for yourself, every time you accept responsibility for your own decisions, every time you embrace the uncertainty that comes with genuine freedom, you're making Jesus' choice. The question isn't whether one choice is right and the other wrong. The question is, which choice will you make? And can you live with the consequences? For Dostoevsky, the conflict between different forms of Christianity wasn't merely a theological dispute. It was a battle for the soul of humanity itself. He believed the Western Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, had fundamentally betrayed the original message of Christ. In pursuing worldly power, intellectual respectability, social influence, Western churches had lost touch with the spiritual essence of Christian faith. Only Russian Orthodoxy, he argued, had preserved the authentic Christian spirit of humility, suffering, mystical union with God. This wasn't mere nationalist prejudice. It was a carefully developed philosophical and theological position that shaped his entire worldview. Dostoevsky's critique of Roman Catholicism was particularly harsh. He saw the Catholic Church as the direct descendant of the Roman Empire, more concerned with political power than spiritual truth. The Church had corrupted Christ's message by trying to create an earthly kingdom rather than focusing on the kingdom of heaven. It had replaced the spiritual authority of love and humility with the temporal authority of law and coercion. It had substituted rational theology for mystical experience and bureaucratic organization for authentic spiritual community. In Dostoevsky's view, Catholicism represented everything Christ had rejected during his 3 temptations in the wilderness. The Grand Inquisitor was his symbolic representation of Catholic Christianity. The Inquisitor genuinely believes he's serving humanity by taking away the terrible burden of spiritual freedom. He has convinced himself that most people are too weak and ignorant to handle the responsibility of making their own religious choices. Therefore, the Church must make these choices for them, providing clear doctrines, absolute authority, relief from spiritual uncertainty. This is presented as compassion. But Dostoevsky saw it as fundamental betrayal of Christ's message. By removing freedom, the Church had also removed the possibility of genuine faith, love, spiritual growth. He argued that this corruption wasn't accidental but inevitable, giving Catholic theology an institutional structure. The Catholic emphasis on papal authority and church tradition had replaced the direct personal relationship between the individual believer and God. The development of sophisticated theological systems had replaced simple faith with intellectual complexity. The accumulation of worldly wealth and political power had corrupted the Church's spiritual mission. The result was a form of Christianity that was Christian in name only, having lost the essential spirit that made Christianity revolutionary and transformative. Protestantism, in Dostoevsky's view, was even worse, because it carried the logic of Western Christianity to its ultimate conclusion. By rejecting papal authority and church tradition, Protestants had opened the door to complete individualism and relativism. If every believer could interpret Scripture for themselves, then there was no objective religious truth at all. If salvation came through faith alone, rather than participation in spiritual community, then religion became a purely private matter with no social or cultural significance. Protestantism had inadvertently prepared the way for secularization by making religion optional and subjective. It was a transitional phase between traditional Christianity and complete atheism. Dostoevsky saw socialism as the logical culmination of both Catholic and Protestant eras. Socialism promised to create the perfect earthly society that Catholicism had sought through church authority and political power. It offered the individual liberation that Protestantism had promised through rejection of external authority. But it achieved both goals by eliminating God entirely and putting human reason and human will in God's place. Socialism was the final form of the Western Christian heresy, the attempt to create heaven on earth through human effort rather than divine grace. It retained the Christian concern for justice and equality, while rejecting the Christian understanding of human nature and divine providence. Against all these Western deviations, Dostoevsky held up Russian Orthodoxy as the true embodiment of Christian faith. Orthodoxy had never sought worldly power or tried to create earthly kingdoms. It had preserved the mystical and contemplative dimensions of Christianity the Western churches had lost in their pursuit of rational theology and social influence. Orthodox believers understood that spiritual life was primarily about suffering, humility, union with God, rather than about intellectual understanding or moral achievement. They recognized that the Church was a community of sinners seeking redemption rather than an institution of saints dispensing salvation. They maintained the primitive Christian understanding that this world was fallen and that ultimate hope lay in the world to come. The Orthodox emphasis on suffering was particularly important to Dostoevsky's religious philosophy. While Western Christianity often tried to minimize or explain away the reality of suffering, Orthodoxy embraced suffering as an essential part of the spiritual path. Through suffering, believers learned compassion for others who suffer. Through suffering, they were purified of pride, selfishness, illusion. Through suffering, they participated in Christ's own passion and came to understand the mystery of redemption. Suffering wasn't an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but a sacred opportunity for spiritual growth and transformation. This understanding of suffering was connected to the Orthodox concept of kenosis, the self-emptying love that Christ demonstrated in his incarnation and crucifixion. True Christian love required complete surrender of self-will and willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of others. This wasn't mere altruism or humanitarian concern, but mystical participation in God's own love for creation. Such love could not be achieved through moral effort or intellectual understanding, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. It required the kind of humility and self-surrender that Western individualism made almost impossible to achieve. Dostoevsky illustrated these orthodox principles through characters like Alyosha Karamazov, Prince Mishkin, Father Zosima. These characters embody the orthodox ideal of holy simplicity, combining deep spiritual wisdom with childlike innocence. They don't rely on theological arguments or moral reasoning to guide their actions. Instead, they respond to each situation with spontaneous love and compassion, trusting that God will work through their simple faithfulness. They're willing to suffer for others and to forgive even the most terrible wrongs. They see Christ in every human being, no matter how degraded or sinful that person might appear. But Dostoevsky didn't present these orthodox ideals in a naive or sentimental way. Characters like Prince Mishkin often appear foolish or ineffective by worldly standards. Their goodness doesn't always produce good results, and their love doesn't always heal the people they try to help. Sometimes, their very innocence becomes a source of suffering for themselves and others. Dostoevsky understood that Orthodox Christianity offered no guarantee of worldly success or even personal happiness. What it offered was the possibility of spiritual authenticity and ultimate meaning in the face of a world that often seemed meaningless and absurd. The political implications of this religious vision were profound. If Russian Orthodoxy represented true Christianity, then Russia had a messianic mission to save the world from Western materialism and spiritual corruption. Russian civilization, despite all its obvious problems and failures, was spiritually superior to Western civilization because it had preserved the authentic Christian spirit. The Russian people, despite their poverty and backwardness, were closer to God than the educated and prosperous peoples of Western Europe. This vision combined genuine religious insight with dangerous nationalist fantasy in ways that would have terrible consequences. Dostoevsky believed that the final spiritual battle of human history would be fought between Russian Orthodoxy and Western secularism. Either the world would embrace the Orthodox understanding of suffering, humility, mystical union with God, or it would complete its descent into materialism, atheism, spiritual darkness. There was no middle ground between these alternatives. The choice was between Christ and Antichrist, between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, between salvation and damnation. In this cosmic struggle, Russia was destined to play the role of the suffering servant who would redeem the world through its willingness to bear the pain that others refuse to accept. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. Perhaps the deepest truths about existence cannot be grasped through reason alone. Perhaps they can only be experienced through suffering, embraced through faith, lived through love. And perhaps the path to these truths requires letting go of everything you think you know and surrendering to something greater than yourself. At the deepest level of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies a simple but revolutionary claim. Love is not merely one human emotion among others. Love is the fundamental force that holds the universe together, the ultimate reality behind all appearances, the final answer to every philosophical question. This isn't the sentimental love celebrated in popular culture, nor the rational benevolence advocated by moral philosophers. It's a cosmic principle that manifests itself most clearly in suffering, sacrifice, the willingness to bear the pain of others. For Dostoevsky, love in this ultimate sense is identical with God, and the capacity for such love is what makes human beings capable of redemption. This understanding emerged from his own experience of suffering and spiritual transformation. During those years in the Siberian prison camp, he witnessed the worst aspects of human nature, but also moments of unexpected compassion and self-sacrifice. He saw hardened criminals risk their lives to help fellow prisoners. He observed acts of kindness that had no rational explanation or practical benefit. He experienced moments when the barriers between self and others seemed to dissolve, and he felt a profound connection to all suffering humanity. These experiences convinced him that beneath the surface of human cruelty and selfishness lay a deeper reality of universal love that could transform even the most degraded souls. But Dostoevsky's concept of love was paradoxical and often difficult to understand. True love, he believed, could only emerge through complete acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to avoid pain, either for themselves or others, could never develop the spiritual depth necessary for genuine love. Those who sought happiness and pleasure as their primary goals would remain trapped in selfishness and superficiality. Only those willing to embrace suffering as a path to spiritual growth could transcend their ego boundaries and participate in the universal love that connected all beings. This meant that love often looked like its opposite, appearing as tragedy, loss, heartbreak, rather than joy and fulfillment. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot represents pure, innocent love that seeks nothing for itself and gives everything to others. But Mishkin's love is tragic because it cannot protect him or those he loves from suffering. His very goodness becomes a source of destruction because the world is not prepared to receive such unconditional love. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that Mishkin's apparent failure is actually a form of success because his love plants seeds that may bear fruit in the future. Even when love cannot prevent suffering, it can transform the meaning of that suffering and point toward ultimate redemption. Alyosha Karamazov represents a more mature and practical form of love that has learned to work within the limitations of human nature and social reality. Alyosha doesn't try to save everyone or solve all problems through the sheer force of his goodness. Instead, he responds to each person and situation with specific acts of compassion appropriate to the circumstances. He listens without judging, forgives without conditions, helps without expecting gratitude or recognition. His love is quiet and undemonstrative, but it has a transformative effect on almost everyone he encounters. Through Alyosha, Dostoevsky shows how love can be both completely selfless and completely practical. The contrast between these loving characters and those who lack love reveals the central tragedy of human existence. Characters like Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, the underground man, are capable of brilliant intellectual analysis and profound emotional sensitivity, but they're trapped in their own subjectivity and cannot break through to genuine connection with others. Their intelligence becomes a prison that separates them from the spontaneous flow of life and love. They understand everything except the most important thing: how to love and be loved. Their tragedy isn't that they're evil, but that they're isolated from the source of all meaning and joy. Dostoevsky believed that this isolation was the fundamental problem of modern civilization. Rationalism, individualism, materialism had taught people to view themselves as separate atoms competing for scarce resources in an indifferent universe. This worldview made genuine love almost impossible, because it was based on the assumption that self-interest and altruism were fundamentally opposed. People could cooperate when it served their mutual interests, but they could not love in the ultimate sense, because they could not transcend their ego boundaries. The result was a civilization that was technologically advanced, but spiritually impoverished, capable of great achievements, but incapable of genuine happiness or meaning. The alternative was what Dostoevsky called sobornost, a Russian Orthodox concept that refers to spiritual unity achieved through love. Sobornost is not mere cooperation or social solidarity, but mystical participation in the divine love that connects all beings. When people experience sobornost, they discover that their deepest interests are not separate from the interests of others, but identical with them. They realize that the boundaries between self and other are illusions created by ego, and that true fulfillment comes through self-transcendence rather than self-assertion. This realization cannot be achieved through intellectual effort or moral willpower, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. Father Zosima, in The Brothers, Karamazov embodies this ideal and serves as Dostoevsky's most complete representation of how love transforms human consciousness. Zosima teaches that every human being is responsible for everyone else, and that all suffering is shared suffering. When one person sins, all humanity is diminished. When one person is redeemed, all humanity is lifted up. This interconnectedness is not a moral obligation imposed from outside, but a spiritual reality that becomes visible to those who have learned to love truly. Zosima can see Christ in every person because he has transcended the ego boundaries that normally separate people from each other. But Dostoevsky was too honest about human nature to present love as an easy solution. True love requires enormous sacrifice and often leads to what appears to be failure and defeat. Those who love most deeply often suffer most intensely because they open themselves to the pain of others as well as their own pain. Love does not eliminate evil or prevent tragedy. It transforms the meaning of evil and tragedy by placing them in the context of ultimate redemption. This transformation is real and profound, but it's often invisible to those who judge by worldly standards of success and failure. Dostoevsky also understood that love could be corrupted and perverted in various ways. Possessive love that tries to control and manipulate others is not love at all but disguised selfishness. Sentimental love that refuses to confront reality and make difficult choices is actually self-indulgence. Ideological love that claims to serve humanity while ignoring the needs of actual individual people is dangerous fanaticism. True love requires wisdom, courage, willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. It's the most difficult and demanding of all human activities, which is why so few people ever achieve it fully. The ultimate test of love, according to Dostoevsky, is forgiveness. Anyone can love those who are kind, attractive, deserving. But only those transformed by grace can love their enemies, forgive those who have hurt them, see the divine image in those who appear completely evil. This kind of forgiveness is not merely an ethical choice, but a spiritual recognition that all human beings share the same fundamental nature, despite their surface differences. Those who can forgive in this ultimate sense have moved beyond ordinary categories of justice and injustice to participate in the divine perspective that sees all beings as equally precious and equally in need of redemption. Dostoevsky believed that the capacity for such love and forgiveness was the ultimate mark of human dignity and the final answer to all philosophical questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Those who achieved this level of spiritual development became channels through which divine love could enter the world and transform it. They could not eliminate suffering or solve all human problems, but they could change the spiritual atmosphere in which those problems existed. Their presence reminded others of possibilities they had forgotten and hopes they had abandoned. Through their example, the impossible became possible, and the kingdom of heaven became present even in the midst of earthly hell. As you drift into sleep, let this thought settle in your consciousness. You are not as separate from others as you think. The love you're capable of is not just a pleasant emotion, but a participation in the force that holds the universe together. And every act of genuine love, no matter how small, is a victory over the darkness that threatens to overwhelm everything. Writing in the 1870s, decades before the rise of fascism and communism, Dostoevsky predicted with astonishing accuracy how totalitarian movements would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. In his novel Demons, he created a prophetic vision of revolutionary terrorism that anticipated the tactics and psychology of 20th century political extremism. But his insight went deeper than mere political prediction. He understood the spiritual and psychological roots of totalitarianism and why modern civilization was inevitably moving toward unprecedented forms of tyranny. The central insight was his understanding that totalitarianism emerges not from traditional authoritarianism, but from the collapse of traditional beliefs and institutions. Traditional tyrants claimed authority based on divine right, inherited legitimacy, military conquest. They ruled through fear and force, but they didn't typically try to control every aspect of their subjects' lives or reshape human nature itself. Modern totalitarianism, by contrast, emerges from democratic and egalitarian movements that claim to represent the will of the people and the march of historical progress. Totalitarian leaders present themselves not as conquerors but as servants of humanity, working to eliminate suffering and create perfect societies. This makes their tyranny far more dangerous and more difficult to resist than traditional despotism. Dostoevsky saw that this new form of tyranny would emerge from the philosophical ideas gaining popularity among European intellectuals. Materialism taught that human beings were nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and social laws. If this were true, then human behavior could be predicted and controlled through proper manipulation of environmental conditions. Rationalism taught that reason could solve all human problems and create perfect social institutions. If this were true, then those who possessed superior rational knowledge had the right and obligation to impose their plans on everyone else. Atheism taught that there were no objective moral truths or transcendent sources of meaning. If this were true, then moral values were simply human constructions that could be changed at will to serve political purposes. The combination of these ideas created a perfect intellectual foundation for totalitarian politics. If human beings were merely biological machines, they had no inherent dignity or rights that would limit what could be done to them in service of social goals. If reason was the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals and planners had the right to override the preferences and traditions of ordinary people. If moral values were arbitrary social constructions, then any action could be justified if it served the supposedly rational goals of the revolutionary movement. These ideas, which seemed progressive and humane to 19th century liberals, contained the seeds of unprecedented cruelty and oppression. In Demons, Dostoevsky illustrated how these abstract philosophical ideas would translate into concrete political action. The novel's revolutionary characters begin with genuine concern about social injustice and sincere desire to help the oppressed. But their commitment to ideological purity gradually overwhelms their basic human decency and moral sense. They become willing to lie, steal, murder in service of their cause because they've convinced themselves that their personal feelings and moral scruples are obstacles to the greater good. They develop elaborate theoretical justifications for actions they would have considered obviously evil before their ideological conversion. The result is a form of evil that's far more dangerous than traditional criminality because it operates with a clear conscience and claims moral legitimacy. Dostoevsky understood that this kind of ideological fanaticism would appeal particularly to educated young people who had lost traditional religious faith but retained the need for meaning and purpose. Revolutionary movements offered these individuals a sense of mission and significance that secular culture could not provide. By joining a cause that promised to transform the world, They could feel that their lives mattered in some ultimate sense. By identifying with the supposedly inevitable march of historical progress, they could feel they were on the winning side of a cosmic struggle. By embracing an ideology that explained everything and promised to solve all problems, they could escape from the uncertainty and ambiguity that characterized modern life. Revolutionary movements functioned as substitute religions for people who could no longer believe in traditional religions. But Dostoevsky also saw that these movements would inevitably betray their own ideals and become tyrannical. The same philosophical assumptions that justified revolutionary violence against the old order would eventually justify tyrannical control over the new order. If human beings were rational machines, they could be programmed to behave in socially beneficial ways. If traditional moral values were obstacles to progress, people would need to be re-educated to accept new values. If individual preferences conflicted with collective goals, individual preferences would have to be suppressed for the greater good. The logic that justified revolution would inevitably lead to totalitarian control once the revolutionaries gained power. The character of Shigalyov in Demons represents this progression. Shigalyov begins with the goal of creating perfect equality and freedom for all humanity. But when he works out the practical implications of his ideas, he discovers that perfect equality requires the complete elimination of individual freedom. His ideal society would divide humanity into two groups: a small elite who would make all decisions, and a large mass who would live in conditions of perfect equality but complete subservience. Shigalyov presents this not as a betrayal of his original ideals, but as their logical fulfillment. True freedom and equality, he argues, can only be achieved through the elimination of the false freedom and equality that allows some people to dominate others. This paradox runs through all totalitarian movements. They promise liberation but deliver enslavement. They claim to serve the people but end up treating people as raw material for social engineering projects. They begin with humanitarian goals, but end up committing atrocities that surpass anything achieved by traditional tyrants. This isn't accidental corruption of originally good intentions, but the inevitable result of the philosophical assumptions on which these movements are based. Any political philosophy that denies human dignity, transcendent moral truth, the mystery of human nature, will eventually produce tyrannical results. Dostoevsky also predicted that totalitarian movements would use terror not merely as a practical tool for gaining power, but as a psychological technique for transforming human consciousness. Terror serves to break down traditional social bonds and moral inhibitions that might interfere with ideological conformity. When people live in constant fear of denunciation and punishment, they learn to suppress their own thoughts and feelings and adopt whatever attitudes the regime demands. They become psychologically dependent on the very system that oppresses them because it provides the only source of security and meaning in their devastated lives. Terror doesn't merely force external compliance. It reshapes the inner life of its victims in ways that make genuine resistance almost impossible. The novel's most chilling scenes involve the psychological manipulation and destruction of individuals who initially resist the revolutionary movement. The characters aren't simply killed or imprisoned, but systematically broken down through a combination of ideological pressure, social isolation, carefully orchestrated psychological torture. Their resistance isn't overcome through rational argument, but through deliberate destruction of their capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. They're transformed from free individuals into instruments of the movement's will. This process anticipates the sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation that would be developed by 20th-century totalitarian regimes. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight concerns the religious dimension of totalitarian movements. These movements aren't merely political, but essentially religious in nature. offering their adherents a comprehensive worldview that explains everything and promises ultimate salvation. They demand not merely obedience but faith, not merely compliance but enthusiastic participation in their sacred mission. They create their own rituals, martyrs, sacred texts that function exactly like religious institutions. They promise their followers immortality through identification with the movement and its supposedly eternal goals. This religious dimension makes totalitarian movements far more powerful and persistent than purely political tyrannies, because they satisfy deep spiritual needs that secular culture cannot address. The ultimate horror of totalitarianism, according to Dostoevsky, is not that it makes people miserable, but that it makes them satisfied with their misery by destroying their capacity for independent thought and authentic feeling. Totalitarian systems create populations of people who genuinely believe that their oppression is freedom and their degradation is dignity. They lose the ability to imagine alternatives to their condition and become psychologically incapable of genuine rebellion. This represents the complete triumph of evil, because it eliminates not merely the reality of goodness, but even the memory of what goodness might look like. It's the final victory of the Grand Inquisitor's vision over the vision of Christ. Let this warning echo in your mind as you fall asleep. The greatest tyrannies don't announce themselves as tyrannies. They present themselves as liberations. They don't crush human spirit through obvious oppression. They reshape it from within until people can no longer remember what freedom felt like. And the path to such tyranny is paved not with evil intentions, but with the certainty that we know what's best for everyone else. Long before existentialism became a recognized philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had identified and dramatized its central insights. Through characters like the underground man, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, he explored themes that would later become the foundation of existentialist thought: the absurdity of existence, the burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, the search for authentic selfhood in a meaningless universe. But Dostoevsky's existentialism was different from the secular existentialism that would emerge in the 20th century, because it was grounded in profound spiritual struggle rather than rejection of all spiritual possibilities. For Dostoevsky, the confrontation with meaninglessness was not the end of the philosophical journey, but the beginning of a deeper search for transcendent meaning. The underground man represents the first fully developed existentialist hero in literature. He is acutely aware that his existence precedes any essence or meaning he might try to impose upon it. He knows he's radically free to choose who he wants to be. But he also knows this freedom is a terrible burden that most people try to escape. He understands that all human values and institutions are human constructions, rather than objective features of reality. He recognizes that reason cannot provide ultimate guidance, because reason itself is just another human tool with no transcendent authority. These insights anticipate the central themes of existentialist philosophy by several decades. But the underground man's response to these insights is profoundly different from that of later existentialist thinkers. Instead of embracing his freedom and creating his own values, he becomes paralyzed by the recognition of his radical responsibility. Instead of affirming life despite its apparent meaninglessness, he retreats into bitter isolation and self-destructive behavior. Instead of finding authenticity through acceptance of anxiety and uncertainty, he becomes consumed by resentment and spite. The underground man shows us what happens when existentialist insights are divorced from any spiritual or transcendent framework that could give them positive meaning. Without God or some other source of objective value, existential freedom becomes a curse rather than a blessing. Dostoevsky's exploration of the divided self was equally prophetic. His characters aren't unified personalities, but complex battlegrounds, where conflicting impulses, beliefs, desires, struggle for dominance. Raskolnikov contains both a potential saint and a potential criminal, and his actions emerge from the temporary victory of one aspect over others. Ivan Karamazov is simultaneously a believer and an atheist, capable of profound religious insight and equally profound religious rebellion. The underground man is both a penetrating social critic and a pathetic failure who cannot apply his insights to his own life. These characters anticipate the modern psychological understanding of personality as multiple and contradictory rather than single and coherent. This division of the self creates what existentialists would later call authenticity problems. If we contain multiple conflicting selves, which one represents our true identity? If our conscious thoughts and stated values conflict with our unconscious drives and actual behavior, which should we trust? If we can observe ourselves thinking and feeling, who is the observer and who is the observed? These questions torment Dostoevsky's characters and drive them to increasingly desperate attempts to achieve some kind of unified selfhood. But their efforts usually fail because the division is built into the structure of human consciousness itself. Dostoevsky understood that this divided consciousness was both a burden and an opportunity. The same self-awareness that makes authentic action difficult also makes moral growth possible. The same capacity for self-observation that creates anxiety and paralysis also enables genuine self-knowledge and repentance. The same freedom that allows people to choose evil also allows them to choose good. The divide itself is the price we pay for being human. But it's also what makes genuine humanity possible. Without the capacity to step outside ourselves and observe our own thoughts and actions, we would be no different from animals acting on instinct. The existential themes in Dostoevsky's work also include profound exploration of what would later be called bad faith, the tendency to deny one's freedom and responsibility by pretending to be determined by external forces. Many of his characters try to escape the burden of choice by convincing themselves that their actions are determined by their social circumstances, psychological makeup, philosophical beliefs. Raskolnikov claims his murder was justified by his theory about extraordinary individuals, but this is really an attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his free choice to kill. The underground man blames his problems on social conditions and psychological determinism, but this is really an excuse for his refusal to take positive action. These characters demonstrate how easy it is to use sophisticated intellectual analysis as a way of avoiding genuine moral responsibility. But Dostoevsky also shows us characters who achieve authentic existence by fully accepting their freedom and responsibility. Alyosha Karamazov doesn't try to escape the burden of choice by appealing to external authorities or deterministic explanations. He takes full responsibility for his actions and their consequences while remaining open to grace and guidance from beyond himself. Sonya Marmeladova in Crime and Punishment freely chooses to sacrifice herself for her family while maintaining her dignity and moral integrity. These characters show that authenticity is possible, but it requires enormous courage and spiritual strength. It cannot be achieved through intellectual analysis alone, but requires fundamental transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. The existential dimension of Dostoevsky's work is most clearly visible in his treatment of death and mortality. His characters are constantly aware that they will die, and that this fact renders all their projects and concerns ultimately meaningless from a cosmic perspective. This awareness of mortality creates both anxiety and urgency. If life is short and death is certain, then every choice matters enormously, because there may not be opportunities to correct mistakes. But if death makes everything meaningless, then no choice matters at all, because all outcomes lead to the same ultimate destination. This paradox creates the existential tension that drives much of the psychological drama in Dostoevsky's novels. Prince Myshkin in The Idiot embodies a unique response to this existential situation. His epilepsy gives him direct experience of what he believes to be the eternal moment that exists beyond time and death. This experience allows him to live with complete presence and authenticity, because he has seen that temporal existence is not the only reality. But his knowledge also makes him unable to function effectively in ordinary social reality, because he cannot take seriously the things that most people consider important. Myshkin represents both the possibility and the cost of transcending the normal existential predicament. His authenticity comes at the price of practical effectiveness and ordinary human happiness. Dostoevsky's influence on later existentialist thinkers was enormous, though often unacknowledged. Kierkegaard, usually considered the father of existentialism, was deeply influenced by Dostoevsky's exploration of anxiety, despair, the leap of faith. Nietzsche's concept of the overman and his critique of conventional morality owe much to characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Sartre's analysis of bad faith and the burden of freedom clearly draws on insights that Dostoevsky dramatized decades earlier. Camus's treatment of the absurd and the rebel shows the influence of characters like the Underground Man and Ivan Karamazov. Even Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence and being toward death reflects themes that Dostoevsky explored in psychological rather than philosophical terms. But Dostoevsky's existentialism differed fundamentally from most later versions because it remained open to religious and spiritual possibilities. While 20th century existentialists typically assumed that God was dead and that humans had to create meaning entirely through their own efforts, Dostoevsky saw the confrontation with meaninglessness as a necessary step toward authentic religious faith. His characters who achieve genuine authenticity do so not by rejecting all transcendent possibilities, but by moving through despair to a deeper level of spiritual understanding. For Dostoevsky, existential honesty about the human condition was not incompatible with religious faith, but actually required such faith to avoid falling into nihilistic despair. This religious dimension makes his work more hopeful and ultimately more humane than much of the existentialist literature that followed. As you drift into sleep, hold this paradox. You are radically free to choose who you become, yet you cannot escape the fundamental structures of human existence. You must create meaning for your life, yet you cannot do so entirely alone. You are responsible for every choice, yet grace operates beyond the realm of human control. This is the existential condition. And Dostoevsky understood it better than almost anyone who has ever lived. Decades before Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, Dostoevsky had already mapped the unconscious territories of the human mind with unprecedented precision and insight. His novels function as case studies in psychological analysis, revealing the hidden drives, repressed desires, unconscious conflicts that motivate human behavior. Freud himself acknowledged this debt, ranking Dostoevsky second only to Shakespeare in literary achievement, and declaring that the Russian novelist had anticipated many of the central discoveries of psychoanalytic theory. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights went beyond anything academic psychology would achieve, because they were grounded in direct observation of human nature under extreme conditions, rather than theoretical speculation. Dostoevsky understood that human beings are driven by forces that operate below the level of conscious awareness. People rarely act for the reasons they claim to act, and they often pursue goals that directly contradict their stated values and rational interests. Raskolnikov tells himself he commits murder to help the poor and tests his theory about extraordinary individuals. But the real motivation is his need to assert power and overcome his sense of personal inadequacy. The underground man claims he withdraws from society because other people are inferior and unworthy of his attention. But the real reason is his terror of rejection and his inability to risk genuine human connection. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against God's existence, but his atheism is really driven by his emotional inability to accept a world in which innocent children suffer. In each case, the conscious explanation serves to hide rather than reveal the true psychological dynamics at work. This insight into the divided nature of human motivation was revolutionary. If people don't understand their own motivations, then rational arguments and moral exhortations are largely useless for changing behavior. If unconscious drives are more powerful than conscious intentions, then social reform efforts that appeal only to reason and self-interest are doomed to failure. If psychological conflicts operate outside the realm of voluntary control, then traditional approaches to criminal justice and moral education need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Dostoevsky was particularly brilliant in his analysis of what psychologists would later call defense mechanisms, the unconscious strategies that people use to protect themselves from painful truths. Rationalization allows people to create logical explanations for behavior that's actually driven by irrational emotional needs. Projection allows people to attribute their own unacceptable impulses to others, rather than acknowledging them in themselves. Denial allows people to refuse to see obvious realities that would force them to change their self-image or behavior. Compensation allows people to excel in one area as a way of making up for felt inadequacies in another. Sublimation allows people to channel antisocial impulses into socially acceptable activities. Dostoevsky's characters demonstrate all of these mechanisms with psychological accuracy that wouldn't be matched by academic psychology for decades. The underground man is perhaps the most psychologically complex character in all of literature because he's simultaneously the subject and object of psychological analysis. He understands his own defense mechanisms perfectly well, but this understanding doesn't free him from them. He knows his resentment is irrational, his social philosophy is self-serving, his isolation is self-imposed. But knowing these things only makes his problems worse rather than better. He becomes trapped in endless layers of self-consciousness, analyzing his analysis until he can no longer distinguish between genuine insight and psychological manipulation. This represents a profound discovery about the limits of psychological self-awareness as a therapeutic tool. Simply understanding your problems doesn't automatically solve them, and excessive self-analysis can become a new form of pathology. Dostoevsky also anticipated insights about the relationship between psychological trauma and adult behavior patterns. Many of his characters have experienced childhood abuse, abandonment, other forms of early trauma that continue to influence their adult relationships and life choices. Smerdyakov's murderous hatred stems partly from his experience of being an illegitimate child, never fully accepted by his father or social environment. Nastasia Filipovna's self-destructive behavior in The Idiot reflects her psychological devastation from childhood sexual abuse. The underground man's social anxiety and resentment can be traced to early experiences of humiliation and rejection. But Dostoevsky never presents trauma as a complete explanation for adult behavior, because that would eliminate moral responsibility and the possibility of redemption. Trauma influences but does not determine adult choices, and people retain the capacity to transcend their psychological conditioning through spiritual transformation. One of Dostoevsky's most important psychological insights concerns the role of guilt and conscience in human motivation. Many of his characters are driven by unconscious guilt about real or imagined wrongdoing, and this guilt manifests in various forms of self-punishment and self-sabotage. Raskolnikov's illness and eventual confession result from his psychological inability to live with the guilt of murder, even though he consciously believes his action was justified. The underground man's self-isolation and misery represent a form of self-imposed punishment for his perceived moral and social failures. Ivan Karamazov's mental breakdown reflects his unconscious sense of responsibility for his father's murder, even though he didn't directly participate in the crime. These characters demonstrate that conscience operates as an autonomous psychological force that cannot be eliminated through rational argument or philosophical sophistication. But Dostoevsky also understood that guilt could be pathological and destructive rather than morally beneficial. Excessive guilt can lead to psychological paralysis, self-hatred, inability to accept forgiveness and redemption. Some of his characters become so consumed by guilt that they lose the capacity for positive action and healthy relationships. They become addicted to suffering as a way of appeasing their punitive superego. But this suffering doesn't lead to genuine moral improvement or spiritual growth. True redemption requires not the elimination of guilt, but its transformation through grace and genuine repentance. This insight anticipates modern therapeutic approaches that distinguish between healthy guilt that promotes moral behavior and neurotic guilt that inhibits psychological functioning. Dostoevsky's analysis of love and sexuality was equally profound and ahead of its time. He understood that romantic love often involves psychological projection, wish fulfillment, the attempt to use another person to solve one's own internal conflicts. Characters like Nastasia Filipovna and Grushenka are loved not for who they really are, but for what they represent in the psychological economy of their admirers. Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasia is partly motivated by his need to save someone as a way of giving meaning to his own suffering. Dmitry Karamazov's passion for Grushenka reflects his unconscious search for maternal acceptance and approval. These relationships are psychologically complex rather than simply romantic because they involve the intersection of multiple unconscious needs and conflicts. Dostoevsky also anticipated insights about the psychology of power and dominance that would later be developed by thinkers like Nietzsche and Adler. Many of his characters are motivated by what psychologists would call the will to power, the need to assert control over their environment and other people as a way of compensating for feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. Raskolnikov's theory about extraordinary individuals is really a rationalization for his psychological need to feel superior to ordinary people. The underground man's intellectual sophistication serves partly as a weapon for asserting dominance over those he considers less insightful. Ivan Karamazov's atheistic philosophy functions partly as a way of asserting independence from divine authority. These characters show how intellectual and spiritual pursuits can be corrupted by unconscious power drives that operate beneath the surface of conscious motivation. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most profound psychological insight concerns the relationship between suffering and psychological development. He understood that people often unconsciously seek out suffering because it serves important psychological functions that pleasure and happiness cannot provide. Suffering can validate one's sense of being special or different from others. It can provide a sense of meaning and purpose for those who feel their lives are otherwise insignificant. It can serve as a form of self-punishment that appeases guilt and provides relief from psychological tension. It can create bonds of sympathy and connection with others who have also suffered. And it can serve as a catalyst for spiritual growth and transformation that wouldn't occur under comfortable circumstances. This understanding of suffering as psychologically functional, rather than simply pathological, was far ahead of its time and remains controversial even today. As sleep takes you, consider this: you are not as transparent to yourself as you think. Beneath your conscious thoughts and stated motivations lies an entire universe of unconscious drives, repressed desires, hidden conflicts. Understanding this doesn't mean you're controlled by forces beyond your power. It means you're more complex, more mysterious, more capable of transformation than you ever imagined. And that complexity is what makes you fully human. At the very center of Dostoevsky's philosophical universe lies an eternal battle between faith and doubt that can never be definitively resolved through rational argument or empirical evidence. Combined with his revolutionary understanding that suffering is the fundamental condition through which human beings achieve spiritual growth and authentic meaning, these twin insights form the foundation of his enduring legacy and his prophetic vision for humanity's future. This struggle is not merely an intellectual debate about the existence of God, but an existential crisis that affects every aspect of human existence. Suffering is not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but the crucible in which human souls are refined and transformed. Together, these insights create a philosophy that is both deeply challenging and ultimately redemptive. Dostoevsky himself embodied this struggle throughout his entire life. His arrest, imprisonment, years in Siberia subjected his faith to the most severe possible tests, while teaching him that extreme suffering could serve as a pathway to spiritual transformation. He witnessed cruelty and suffering that seemed to make a mockery of belief in a loving God. Yet he also observed how those prisoners who accepted their suffering without becoming consumed by hatred often developed extraordinary capacities for kindness, wisdom, moral insight. This experience convinced him that the deepest forms of human wisdom, compassion, spiritual insight emerge only through profound suffering that cannot be avoided or easily resolved. The mature Dostoevsky who emerged from this ordeal was neither a simple believer nor a straightforward atheist, but something much more complex and interesting. A man whose faith had been tested by doubt and refined by suffering. This complex relationship between faith, doubt, suffering is dramatized most powerfully through his greatest characters. Ivan Karamazov represents the most sophisticated case for atheism ever presented in literature, rejecting God not on scientific grounds but on moral ones, unable to accept a universe in which innocent children suffer while God remains silent. His rebellion cannot be overcome through theological sophistication, because it's based on a fundamental moral judgment about the nature of reality itself. Yet Dostoevsky shows us that Ivan's atheism leads inevitably to moral relativism and nihilistic despair, undermining the very moral foundations that would make his rebellion against injustice meaningful. Against Ivan stands his brother Alyosha, who chooses to trust in God's goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it. This choice transforms his entire relationship to existence, freeing him to respond with spontaneous love and compassion rather than intellectual paralysis. The philosophy of redemptive suffering is embodied most clearly in characters like Sonia Marmeladova, who maintains her spiritual purity despite degraded circumstances, and Father Zosima, who teaches that all human beings are responsible for the suffering of others, and that true spiritual development requires accepting this responsibility. Sonia's suffering hasn't made her bitter, but has deepened her capacity for love and forgiveness, allowing her to see the divine image even in a murderer like Raskolnikov. Zosima demonstrates how suffering can be transformed into spiritual wisdom, arguing that those who achieve spiritual maturity through suffering become channels through which divine grace can enter the world. But Dostoevsky also shows that suffering can be destructive rather than redemptive depending on how it's received. The underground man's pain has made him spiteful. Ivan's intellectual anguish has led to rebellion against God. Smerdyakov's abuse has turned him into a murderer. The difference lies not in the amount of pain experienced, but in the spiritual attitude with which that pain is received. Redemptive suffering requires what Dostoevsky calls active love, the willingness to bear not only one's own pain, but the pain of others as well. This isn't mere sympathy, but a practical commitment to sharing others' burdens, even when doing so increases one's own suffering. Such love can only emerge from those who have learned to accept their own suffering without resentment, transforming their pain into wisdom and compassion. Prince Mishkin embodies this principle through his Christ-like innocence and willingness to suffer for others, though his very goodness becomes tragically ineffective in a world unprepared to receive such unconditional love. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that even apparently failed acts of redemptive love plant seeds of grace that may bear fruit in future generations, operating on spiritual rather than merely practical levels. The eternal struggle between faith and doubt, combined with the transformative potential of suffering, leads to Dostoevsky's prophetic understanding of humanity's future. Writing decades before the rise of totalitarian movements, he predicted with astonishing accuracy how revolutionary ideologies would evolve into systems of mass oppression and psychological control. The Grand Inquisitor's vision of a society based on bread, miracle, authority, perfectly anticipated the appeal of fascist and communist regimes that would seduce millions with promises of security and relief from the burden of freedom. His novels demonstrated how intellectual sophistication and humanitarian ideals could be corrupted into justifications for terrorism and mass murder, showing that the greatest evils would come from educated idealists who believed they were serving humanity. These political prophecies remain essential for understanding contemporary threats to human freedom and dignity. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights have proven equally prophetic and enduring. His exploration of the unconscious mind, the divided self, the complex motivations that drive human behavior anticipated major psychological discoveries by decades. His understanding of how excessive self-consciousness can paralyze effective action perfectly describes the condition of millions of modern people who know what they should do but cannot bring themselves to do it. His analysis of how childhood trauma, social alienation, spiritual emptiness create psychological disorders remains more penetrating than most contemporary theories. Most importantly, his insight that psychological healing requires spiritual transformation rather than merely technical intervention offers hope for those whom secular psychology has failed to help. The spiritual dimensions of Dostoevsky's work have become even more relevant as modern secular culture has failed to provide the meaning and transcendent significance that human beings need. His prediction that the loss of religious faith would lead to nihilism and moral relativism has been confirmed by societies that have attempted to build purely secular forms of meaning. His understanding that human beings cannot live without transcendent purpose helps explain why secular ideologies so often function as substitute religions, complete with sacred texts and demands for absolute loyalty. His vision of faith as an existential choice rather than an intellectual conclusion provides a way of maintaining religious commitment even in the face of modern criticism and scientific skepticism. Faith for Dostoevsky is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning despite evidence that seems to contradict it. Perhaps most importantly, Dostoevsky's legacy lies in his unflinching honesty about the complexity and difficulty of human existence, combined with his ultimate hope for human transformation. He refused to offer easy solutions or comfortable reassurances, acknowledging the strongest arguments against his own positions through characters as intelligent and sympathetic as those who represent his preferred alternatives. He recognized that the choice between faith and doubt, freedom and security, love and power, cannot be resolved through rational argument alone, but requires fundamental decisions about how to interpret life's ambiguous evidence. This intellectual honesty makes his ultimate affirmations more meaningful, because they emerge from genuine struggle with doubt and despair rather than naive optimism. Dostoevsky's vision for humanity is both deeply pessimistic and ultimately hopeful. He recognized that human beings are capable of extraordinary evil, and that social progress doesn't automatically lead to moral improvement. He understood that the loss of traditional sources of meaning would create psychological crises that couldn't be easily resolved through rational analysis or social reform. He predicted that attempts to create perfect societies through human effort alone would inevitably lead to tyranny and the destruction of everything that makes life worth living. Yet he also believed that humans are capable of transcending their limitations through spiritual transformation and redemptive love, achieving levels of wisdom and compassion that approach the divine. He demonstrated through his greatest characters that even the most degraded individuals can be redeemed through genuine repentance and acceptance of grace. The choice that Dostoevsky presents to humanity remains as relevant today as it was in 19th century Russia. We can choose the path of the Grand Inquisitor, seeking security and relief from freedom's burden, even at the cost of our humanity. We can choose Ivan Karamazov's path, demanding that reality conform to our moral expectations and rejecting any universe that fails to meet our standards. We can choose the underground man's path, retreating into bitter isolation as a way of asserting autonomy in an apparently meaningless world. Or we can choose the path of Christ as Dostoevsky understood it, accepting the burden of freedom and responsibility, while trusting in the possibility of redemption through love. This choice must be renewed constantly throughout our lives, and will determine not only our own fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. As you drift into the depths of sleep, let these final thoughts accompany you into dreams. You are standing at the same crossroads that Dostoevsky's characters faced. The questions that tormented them torment you too. Why do we suffer? What does it mean to be free? How can we find meaning in an apparently meaningless universe? These aren't abstract philosophical problems. They're the fundamental questions of your existence. And how you answer them, how you live in response to them, will determine who you become and what kind of world you help create. Dostoevsky offers no easy answers, but he offers something far more valuable. A vision of what human beings can become when they choose to embrace, rather than flee from the full reality of their condition. A vision of how suffering can be transformed into love. A vision of how freedom can become a blessing rather than a curse. A vision of how faith can emerge from the depths of doubt. This is the gift of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Not a philosophical system or comfortable certainties, but a truthful account of what it means to be human. Delivered by someone who knew suffering intimately, thought more deeply than almost anyone about why we suffer and what suffering means, and ultimately believed that human beings are capable of transformation that approaches the divine. Sleep now, and let these truths work in the depths of your consciousness. Tomorrow, you'll wake to face the eternal questions again, but perhaps you'll face them with a bit more wisdom, a bit more courage, a bit more hope. Because you've spent this night in the company of one of the greatest minds humanity has ever produced. A mind that knew darkness intimately, but never stopped believing in the possibility of light.